On this video, we're going to talk about factoring by grouping. All right, so the very first method that we learned, which was factoring out the GCF, that's what you're always supposed to try first. You guys remember that from this part? For example, right here, we had 12x squared. Well, we had this trinomial expression, and we saw that there was a multiple of 6 in all of them, and there was x's in all of them. So we pulled out the GCF. That's what you're always supposed to try to do first. That way, you might be able to continue factoring in here. So we've already seen that. This is called factoring by grouping. So we're supposed to think about factoring out the GCF. Now, if you look at all these terms, is there x's in every single term? No, there's no x there, so we can't pull out something that's in common. So what we're going to do in factoring by grouping is simply separate it into two groups. All right, and we're going to factor something out of the first group. I'm reading this straight from here. Factor something out of the first group, factor something out of the second group, and then take a step back and factor something in common out of the whole thing. So let me zoom into here, and I want to look at the left side. That's going to be one group, and I want to look at the right side, and that's going to be another group. Okay, so out of the left side, what could I do? Well, in other words, let's ignore the right side for a couple of seconds. So let me ignore it by actually making a little rectangle there and blocking it out. So on the first group, what could I factor out? Well, I could factor out an x, right? As a matter of fact, I could factor out more than just an x. I could factor out the GCF, which is x squared. And that's exactly what I explained on the left side of this thing. But as you look down here, I factor out the x squared. What would be left on the inside? If you put parentheses, what's going to be left? If you pull out an x squared, there's going to be an x, because x times x squared gets you the x to the third. And if you pull out an x squared from the second one, then there's going to be a 1 left over, because x squared times 1 gets you that x squared. So we have factored something out of the blue group, right? Now let's look at the red group. And what could we factor out of there? Now, even though it seems like you can't factor out anything, for the sake of factoring by grouping, we're going to factor out the multiple of 1. I know that sounds ridiculous, right? I want to pull out a 1 from here and pull out a 1 from here. So I want to pull a 1 to the outside of the parenthesis, and obviously on the inside I still have the same exact thing. Okay? I know it's a little weird. Anyways, let's move over here. And now we look at the first group and we look at the second group, and we see what we could pull out that's in common in both groups. And as you could see, there's an x plus 1 right here, and there's also an x plus 1 right there, both in parentheses. So what I'm going to do is take both of these guys and pull them out. All right? It's kind of like if I put some parentheses, and if I pull this one out and this one both out, they're going to come out here to the front. And that's going to be the x plus 1 that's out there in the front. And now what would be left? If I pull this x plus 1 out, there's going to be an x squared left over. So I put the x squared right there, and I'll purposely leave a blank spot right here because it's gone now. And if I pull out an x plus 1 out of here, then what's going to be left? Just a plus 1. So keep in mind, I took both of these and I pulled it out. So what's left over? The x squared is left over and the plus 1's left over, so I put them in there. And ladies and gentlemen, we have factored by grouping. In other words, if I were to distribute x times x squared, x times 1, and then distribute 1 times x squared and 1 times 1, we will get the above 4-term polynomial expression. Okay? So once again, whenever you have 4 terms or more, you might want to separate them into two groups. Factor out something from the first group. In this case, it was an x squared. Factor out something from the second group. Even if there's nothing to factor, maybe factoring out a 1 will help you out. And then you look at both groups and you factor out what's in common in both groups, and you write down what's left over. That is factoring by grouping. The only way to get good at this is to practice. So let's take a look at this one down here. There's 4 terms right here. First I need to try to factor out something from all of them. And obviously there's no x's in all of them, so I can't do that. So then I think, okay, maybe let's try factoring by grouping. Let's take a look at our first group, right? In other words, ignore this half and just look at that first group. What could you pull out of that first group? Well, I could pull out an x, actually x squared. So let's pull out an x squared. And what will be left over on the inside? Well, you're going to have a, if you think about x squared times what will get us a 3x to the third, it'll definitely be a 3x. And then x squared times what will get us an x squared? Well, that would be simply a positive 1. So we factored out an x squared from the first group. Now let's cover up this first group. Whoa, let me see if I could fix that. There we go. So let's cover up that first group. I don't know how am I going to cover it. I'll just do that. And let's look at the second group and let's see what we could factor out of the second group. So let's just look at this half of it and say, what could I pull out of here? Well, there's a 15 and a 5. That means I could definitely pull out a positive 5. So let me pull out a positive 5. And what's going to be left over on the inside? On the inside, we're going to have, in other words, 5 times what gets us the 15x? Well, that'll be a 3x. And how could I get this other positive 5? In other words, 5 times what gives me a positive 5? We know that that would be a positive 1. 5 times 1 gives us that positive 5. So we factored out of the second group, okay? So once again, factoring by grouping, what is it? Let me move this to the side. Factoring by grouping is simply looking at your two groups. You could put like a little wall right between there if you want. But you look at your first group and you ask yourself, what could I pull out? Well, I could pull out an x squared from these two. What could I pull out of my second group? Well, I could pull out a 5 from both of these. And then the next step is to take a step back and look at the whole thing. And okay, here's my first group, here's my second group. What could I pull out of my first group that's in common with the second group? Well, there's a 3x plus 1 right here. There's a 3x plus 1 right here. So we're going to factor out that 3x plus 1 binomial. Yeah, it's inside parentheses. We're actually going to factor it out with those parentheses. Check it out. 3x plus 1. There it is. Now, if I were to pull it out, what would be left over? I'm going to exaggerate the parentheses here. If I pull out the 3x plus 1 from my first group, what's going to be left over? Just the x squared. This is gone, so just the x squared is going to be what's left. So you bring that down. If I were to pull out this 3x plus 1 from the second group, what's going to be left? Just the plus 5. So I bring that down, just plus 5. Now obviously, you're not going to leave your factored form answer like this. Alright, I just left this blank spot and this blank spot so you could see that this is now missing right here. I pulled them out. Okay, so I mean, write it with the appropriate size parentheses. 3x plus 1 times x squared plus 5. That's the final factored form right there, factoring by grouping. This next one, you might want to try and pausing the video and you trying to do this on your own on a separate sheet of paper and then hitting play to see if you get this right. The first group, what's in common? What could you pull out? Well, you could pull out x's for sure. And you could pull out, how many x's? You could pull out 4 x's from the first group. So x to the 4th is what we're going to pull out. What's going to be left over on the inside? A simple x and a minus 2. And on the second group, what could you pull out of here? Well, there's a multiple of 2 you could pull out. So let's pull out a positive 2. And if you pull out a positive 2, you're going to have an x minus 2 left over. Now this is where, I mean, factoring by grouping doesn't always work. But at this point, this is where you're happy because you have both x minus 2 right here and x minus 2 right here. So you're going to pull out the x minus 2 and put it out here in the front. X minus 2. What's going to be left over? There's going to be an x to the 4th left over and a positive 2 left over. And of course, let's write it the correct, well, the right size, right? X minus 2, x to the 4th plus 2. Ladies and gentlemen, that is factoring by grouping. I hope this helps. Please feel free to post any questions or comments.